let's get the show on the road. Did everybody see or hear me? Thank you. Thank you all for coming here. And on behalf of Western Libraries, I am delighted to welcome you here to our Speaking of Maps. This is our second presentation in Speaking of Maps. We try to do one every quarter, is our hope. So this is the one for the fall. My name is Rob Lopresti, and I'm the map librarian. Technically, I'm professional lead this quarter, which means Peter Smith back there is the map librarian. Hi, Peter. I get to do the introduction. Lucky me. And you are sitting in the map collection. We have a couple 100,000 maps. We have maps from all over the world. The closer you are to Bellingham, the more maps you'll find, if that makes any sense. In other words, we have more about Mount Baker than we do about Mount Kilimanjaro. But we do have maps from all over the world, and you're welcome to come in here. Our hours are on the door. We also have a website, which not only tells you about our collection, but also has lots of electronic maps, links, and so on. And I would like to thank Mark Greenberg, the Dean of Libraries, for helping make this possible. Dennis Matthews, who actually runs this place on a day-to-day basis. He's in charge of the map collection, and he actually knows where things are much better than I do. You're welcome to talk to him at any point. And our students here who helped set this up. And I want to let you know that copies of Dave's book, which Dave will be talking about, are available through the Associated Students Bookstore right back there for sale. So feel free to pick them up. This is your last chance to grab some goodies before the talk starts. Feel free. And we have a sign-up sheet for future events, which you are welcome to sign up for. So we will let you know when there's going to be anything. That will be there. Also, my business cards and Dennis's business cards are there as well. So, let's get to the main event. Dave Tucker is a resident of Bellingham, Washington. He has a master's in geology from Western. He is a research associate in the Geology Department of Western. He is the director of the Mount Baker Volcano Research Center, which is an all-volunteer nonprofit organization that raises funds to support research and education about our beloved local active volcano. He also leads public field trips and gives presentations about the geology of Northwest Washington, and is the author of the popular blog Northwest Geology Field Trips. And he is the author of a book which he is about to tell you about, I think, which was published by Mountain Press Publishing. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob. I'm glad to have the chance to come down here and talk. Okay, can you all hear me without a microphone? Because I'm going to be advancing, with a sledgehammer, and I need to stand here. So you can hear me okay here? I don't need to go stand at the podium? All right, thanks. Happy to see a crowd here today. I'm Dave Tucker. Rob introduced me. I see some familiar faces in the audience. I am a Bellingham guy. I'll never be a local because I didn't grow up here. I didn't come to Bellingham until I was 20, over 40 years ago. I'll never be a local, however. But I love to do public geology education. That's the thing that I am most interested in. When I was writing my thesis on the Hannigan volcanics, some volcanic rocks to the northeast of Mount Shuxon, back in the early part of this century, the earliest days of this century, actually. The rocks were a little bit younger then. I turned in the first draft of the introduction to my thesis to my advisor, Sue DeVary, on the Geology Department. And she said, great, I'll read through this and get back to you tomorrow. So I walked out the door and went back down to my grad student, little tiny cubby hole of an office. Sue comes downstairs about 10 minutes later. She says, Dave, you have to decide if you are writing a scientific paper or a popular field guide. Because your introduction sounds like an introduction to a book for the public, not a scientific paper. You have to rewrite your introduction. And right then I realized, that's really what I want to be doing, is doing education about geology for the general public, not for necessarily research geologists, although I've certainly published papers and done presentations for geologists. But I really like doing outreach to the public. And that's kind of the direction I've taken since I left graduate school here in 2004. I've never been a professional geologist. I am not a professional geologist, although I've been hired to work on people's field projects, and I've done plenty of my own field research around Mount Baker and a few other places. So I ended up writing this book, and my story today is how the book came to be, what's in it, and some of the inside scoop that you wouldn't hear if you didn't hear me tell you about it. Although I guess it's now going to be in the university archives in this video, so then anybody can get the inside scoop, and we'll never have to come to a presentation again. You got that? Okay, let's go. I grew up in the Northwest. I grew up in Stillicum, just outside of Tacoma, and in view of the Cascades. And in high school, I got into mountaineering. And I climbed up and down on the big volcanoes and the little tiny peaks. Anything to be out in the mountains was good for me. And at that time, as far as I was concerned, there were two kinds of any rock climbers in the crowd here? Any retired rock climbers? Any has-been rock climbers? You know what GFC and NGFC are? Good for climbing, not good for climbing. Other than that, there's no other kinds of rock. You could easily do geology in those two terms, as far as I was concerned. So NGFC rock was rock, you could find a handhold that you really liked and you just picked it up and took it with you all day long. And GFC is like the stuff on the right-hand side there. I started getting really, really interested in what are these rocks that I was climbing on, and why are these volcanoes the way they are? This was back in mid-late 60s, and we didn't really know that much about the Cascade volcanoes. We didn't really have an understanding of the origin of the Cascade Mountains, for that matter, because plate tectonics, the overall theory that kind of ties together much of geology today, was a brand new theory. In fact, when I did my undergraduate geology at the University of Washington, in my geology class in 1970, the professor said, okay, today we're going to talk about plate tectonics for 15 minutes, and then we're going to move on to real geology. I even have my notes from the class. I still have that. So because plate tectonics is such a new idea that somebody's probably going to overturn it in the next few years, so we're not going to waste time teaching undergraduates about plate tectonics. Well, that guy was wrong. So I wanted to learn more about the rocks that I was climbing on and the volcanoes in my backyard. This one that we all know and love. Anybody know where this photograph's taken, by the way?
Twin
This
sisters?
is, I'm sorry?
Twin sisters?
No, this is taken, it's a telephoto lens, it's cheating. This is taken at the Mount Baker Volcano Research Center, Volcano Observatory Site number 1 at the top of Taylor Street. So with a telephoto lens you can get between the houses and get a really nice view of the active crater, Sherman crater of Mount Baker. So in the mid-90s, I was very nearly ready to retire from my third or fourth career. That time I was a mountaineering guide and instructor. And I was working on Mount Baker and teaching crevasse rescue glacier travel courses for the county parks back when they did that kind of a program because they didn't care about liability in those days. And there was a woman in the course, a rather short woman, and learning how to get in and out of crevasses, well, mostly how to get out, because the idea is to learn how not to get in. And I never had a chance to talk to her the whole day that we were out until we're almost back to the car, and I found myself bringing up the rear of the hike. And I asked her who she was and why she was taking that course. Her name is Liz Shermer from the Geology Department at Western. And like I said, I'd always had a fascination with geology since my early climbing days, but I'd taken some classes in university back in the early 70s. Took classes from Don Easterbrook, sitting here. And turns out that Liz was brushing up on some of her mountain travel skills so she could start working with this fellow, Wes Hildreth, from the U.S. Geological Survey, who was just at that time beginning the first in-depth geologic field studies at Mount Baker. I mean, in detail, mapping all the different lava flows, all the different rock units, and trying to put together a comprehensive story of the eruptive history of the volcano. I got all excited. Wow, a geologist coming to work on, my backyard volcano. And I said, well, I'm willing to help on that project. So Liz put me in touch with Wes, and I ended up working with Wes as a volunteer over the next 10 summers doing field work. And on the way, he introduced me to this other fine fellow, Kevin Scott, also from the Geological Survey, who was researching the Holocene history of Mount Baker, the post-glacial period, especially the collapse and Lahar history. So I ended up working with Kevin as well. And that was kind of my introduction to field geology. And one day, our first year, 1994, Wes said, "Hey Dave, do you know anything about the Hannigan volcanics?" I said, "I really don't know anything about them. I know where they are." So we hiked into Hannigan Pass, about a 5-mile hike into Hannigan Pass, where we have this view of the south face of Hannigan Peak. And Wes, who's one of the world's foremost experts on calderas, very large collapse structures, got all excited. He looked at it and gave these rocks the highest accolade that any rock can get from Wes Hildreth, pretty fancy. And then he turned to me and said, "That's your master's thesis." What? Master's thesis? He said, "Yeah." He says, "You need to go back to school." I said, "Wes, I'm 50 years old." He said, "What's that got to do with anything? Go to graduate school and study these rocks and tell us the story, the geologic story." So I did. I ended up going to Western and studying these rocks. This is a 1,000-foot high rock face. It's all volcanic ash, now lithified or hardened into rock, and is the result of a single eruption. So we think of Mount St. Helens 1980 is pretty big because it dumped a few inches of ash on Yakima, but here's something that dumped 1,000 feet of ash at the site of the eruption. That ended up being a great story, a great research project, and a couple of publications for me. And these are the rocks that I was describing when Sue DeBari told me that I needed to decide if I wanted to write for scientists or if I wanted to write for the public. So I wrote for scientists for a while, but then got into the public thing. So I eventually formed an organization called the Mount Baker Volcano Research Center, a nonprofit, all-volunteer group, and we lead field trips around Mount Baker and provide funding for students and both graduate and undergraduate who are doing field work on Mount Baker, not necessarily geologic work. We can fund glaciological work, fund biological work. We funded an ice worm study this past year. Nothing to do with geology, but an interesting topic, and so we raised the money by selling T-shirts and by people buying seats on field trips or places in line on the trail on the field trip. And over the years, we've raised enough money to support some student research projects. And it's being outside talking to the public that I really, really love. And it kind of led to the idea of my book. It's the crater of Mount Baker, Sherman Crater, which is constantly pumping out gases, volcanic gases, mostly steam. You can see those on a nice day. And we collect gas samples from inside the crater to keep tabs on what's going on at depth below the volcano. We take dozens of temperature readings every year in the crater, and we collect gas samples to be analyzed by the Geological Survey to see if there's any chemical changes which could indicate movement of magma or injection of new magma at depth beneath the volcano. It's an essential part of volcano monitoring. This is my day job. I clean roofs and gutters for a living. Like I said, I'm not a professional geologist, but I feel like I understand this topic well enough that I could go ahead and follow through on my original idea and do public geology education. This pays a lot better than being a geologist, let me tell you. So I started writing a road and trail geology guide to Mount Baker and started shopping it around about 6 years ago. And I approached a number of publishers who all told me that, this is too localized a book for us. One of the publishers I went to, Mountain Press Publishers in Missoula, said, that's really a great idea, but we've never heard of Mount Baker, and when I explained where it was, they said, oh yeah, that's up in that little northwest corner of Washington, and we can't ever imagine anybody wanting to buy a book about that. But how about a book for our Geology Underfoot series? Oh, how does that work? So they explained to me about writing these books. I'd never written a book before, or had a book published, and I'd never really gotten serious about it. Next thing I know, I made an agreement with them to produce a book to be published in 1 year. And that was in April 2010. The book was published this past June. So you can see that the 1 year idea was a little out to lunch. And after requesting extensions for the second or third time with my editor, James Lanesbury, I said, I feel kind of sheepish having asked to get this book done in 1 year because clearly it's not doable. And he said, well, I know it wasn't doable. I just figured you must be independently wealthy or something with absolutely nothing to do with your free time, which was certainly not true. So anyway, the book came out. It is part of a series of books called Geology Underfoot. The publisher is the same people who do the Roadside Geology series, so many of you are familiar with those books. But these Underfoot series get you out of the car, or off your bicycle, or out of the bus, however it is you're transporting yourself, and get you up close and personal with the rocks. And they are written by people who are familiar with the geology of the area, and who have some semblance of how to present that material to the public, to explain geologic wonders of these various areas. So my book is the 8th in the series. The Geology Underfoot in Southern Idaho is now coming out within the next less than a year, I think. That'll be number 9. And I understand that there's somebody who's getting started on a Geology Underfoot in some part or another of Oregon. Now, you cannot write a book like this without the help of a lot of people. So I dedicate the book to 2 faculty members at Western, Doctors Chris Suchek and Mari Schwartz, who were instrumental in helping me write. They're both very, very good writers. They held my hand through a lot of the writing process. They both read large parts of the manuscript, did a peer review of some of the chapters. Unfortunately, neither one of them lived to see the book published. It's a big loss to the department to have these 2 gone. But I really have to give them credit for helping me become a writer. At least good enough to send it to the editor, who then helped me become a writer. So the format of the book, like all the Geology Underfoot books, is take you to specific locations and get you out of the car and either walk to the other side of the parking lot or hike 7 miles, somewhere in between, in the different vignettes, to see what the geology is in these locations. So here we have the list of locations. It's a map. So Mount Baker, Bellingham, you can see I have a vignette right down here in Chuckanut. I have one right here on campus in the Geology Museum up at Western, in the Geology Building, Environmental Studies Building. And then the rest of the vignettes are scattered around the state. And of course you can't write about places without visiting them. So this is my road track over the years. And I think you'll see that most of these places were visited more than one time. Because I would have to go back, and oh, those pictures are lousy. What was that road? Is that road still open? I would have to go back to locations to double check. I also sent the draft of each chapter with all the illustrations. Sometimes they were just pencil sketches, both to geologists who had done field work in that specific location. Don Easterbrook, sitting here, reviewed my Double Bluff chapter there, number 11. So some field researcher who was familiar with the area did a peer review. I also sent each chapter to at least 2 different people in the target audience. Friends of mine or people who read my Northwest Geology Field Trips blog. I would just send them a manuscript, and they would go to that place using the directions that I provided, and they would see if the chapter made sense to them. Some of these people were total strangers to me. They're just people who offered to help through reading the blog, were enthusiastic about the book. So the book had a lot of field checking before it even went to the editor. And I think it really shows. It's pretty accurate in terms of directions. No one has yet sent me any hate mail saying I couldn't get to such and such a place yet. I don't know if anybody's read the whole book yet. Anyway, so I traveled around a lot over the course of the years. The hardest part about writing a book was what is not going to go in. Because the geology of Western Washington is far more varied than most people would think. It's much more than glacial deposits and volcanoes in the Cascades. There's a lot of really, really wonderful geologic sites. And I actually started writing chapters on each of these vignettes, which is what the publisher calls a chapter, which eventually did not get into the book. Some of them were completely written and ready to be edited, had been reviewed, field checked, everything. And for space considerations, because I was way over my word budget, it was simple as just to delete chapters rather than try to hack a word here and a sentence there. So some of those chapters ended up not going in. Others kind of made sense not to put them in because like the Twin Sisters are a wonderful place to see a piece of the mantle from deep, from below the crust, but there's really not very many places where the general public would be able to go and lay hands on the rock and study the rocks. So I didn't want to have anything that you could only look at from the distance. I've gotten a lot of flack for not including the one called Rounded Rocks and Crummy Beaches, why we don't have sandy beaches in the Sailor Sea. That seems to be a popular topic. So I may yet have to include a chapter like that on my blog. Anyway, it's really hard to decide what wasn't going to go in the book. But eventually I pulled together the chapters. So I had to write the book for the general public, but I did not want to dumb the book down. I figured my audience are people who are interested in natural history, interested in the earth around them. They may not have a geologic background, they may have never taken any geology courses, but they're intelligent enough to be curious and to be willing to use a glossary. There's a big fat glossary in the back of the book. And in order to learn new things. So I intentionally used some technical terms. I tried to make it as understandable as possible by a non-geologist as I could. And that was another reason why I sent each of the vignettes out to target audience people to read and critique for me, which really helped with the things that I had not explained very well. So we're going to go through one of the vignettes here a little bit, how it came to be, and this is the one right here in the backyard about honeycomb weathering at Larrabee State Park. So each vignette begins with a map to tell you how to get there. And I use shaded relief digital elevation model base maps, which were prepared by a couple of graduate students up at Western. I hired them to provide me with just the shaded topography there, no labels, no roads, no other information on the map. And then I loaded that shaded relief map into an art program called Adobe Illustrator, and then drew in all the lines, colors, labels in that program. And then the chapter takes you, like all the chapters, I take you to specific locations where I try to explain what's going on, what you're seeing. So this honeycomb weathering down at Larrabee State Park is a beautiful feature. It's puzzled a lot of people for a lot of the time, for a long time. And a fellow who did his master's thesis here at Western back in the preceding century, in the 70s, George Musto, who some of you will know, did his master's thesis on the process by which this honeycomb weathering develops in rocks. It's a weathering process that involves algae, the interaction of algae, salt crystals, and sandstone. So it's in part a biologic process and part a chemical process. And George's work is now famous and well known and cited all the time when people do follow-up studies on this honeycomb weathering. So each chapter includes a stop or two or three or four, and I give you directions to get to that specific location. Right here down on the beach, just below the band shell at Larrabee. I'm sure most of the people in this room have been down to this little beach a lot of times. The boat ramp is just around the corner on the other side of this rock. And so I try to explain the origin of these honeycombs, or tuffoni as they're called in the geologic literature. And I'm not going to belabor the whole process here in our presentation tonight. You can read the book if you're that interested. But I used a lot of photographs that were provided to me. George Musto provided this one. This is a scanning electron microscope view of salt crystals that are growing amongst algae, which are growing on the surface of the rock. And this is a big part of the process that allows these honeycomb weathering features to develop on the rock. I solicited photographs from friends and from my blog. I'd say, hey, I don't have a photograph of Blue Lake up near Washington Pass, or I have a photograph and it's really lousy, and here it is, can you do better than that? May I use it in the book? And I'll give you credit and I'll send you a copy. So I would have people providing me, I got 7 or 8 submissions of Blue Lake, for instance, and chose the one that I really liked, and that person got their name in the book. I've never met them. This is one that George provided me. Most of the photographs in the book are mine, but I would say 10% or maybe a few more than that are from other people. So once again, the book takes you to specific locations and where you can learn about the geology right up front. The book is quite different. These books are very different from the roadside geology series of books, which are very unsatisfying if you have much of an interest in geology, because you drive down the road and you're looking out the window and you're trying to figure out what it is you're seeing as your passenger reads the text to you, and they're generally not very good maps. Need a lot of review, need a lot of fixing up those books. And if you really want to lay hands on the rock, you need a book like this Geology Underfoot series. So that is the reason that Mountain Press decided to come out with the Geology Underfoot series, is a sort of a hands-on opportunity to really learn some geology, as opposed to just have something vaguely explained to you. Stop 2 is down at Clayton Beach in the Larrabee Park vignette. place that I've been hanging out for a long, long, long time. I used to do a lot of rock climbing down here on these structures, which are beautiful. Many people see people down there in beautiful golden sunset taking artistic photos. One interesting thing I learned while I was writing this particular chapter is that these features in the rock, these weathering features in the rock, change over time. So here's two photos that were provided to me from Ray Pestrong and John Boxerman at San Francisco State. And they have done a study on changes in these. So 1977 in exactly the same place in 2005. And they had numbered things on the rocks so that they could go back and relocate the same place. And you look at this photo, which is from the book, carefully, and you can begin to see some real changes over a short period of time, less than about 30 years. Once again, photos provided for the book for illustrative purposes from a total stranger. I get a little moralistic in the book. These are very popular for rock climbing, and that can be very, very damaging to these structures. Felt real guilty for the ones I broke off back in my day as a rock climber down there. So in the book, I say that they should not be climbed on. I don't know if that's ethical of me or not, because I used to climb on them, but I wasn't paying attention in those days. I just wanted to get up. So there's sort of the structure of a sample chapter. Another chapter that I have is the Geology Museum, right over here in the ES building, where I focus on the story of the giant flightless bird, Diatryma. We found the fossil footprint up near Kendall, Washington, up the North Fork Nooksack River in 2009, and it's quite a long story and a wonderful story of how we managed to save the fossil bird. I would hope everyone here has been to see it, the fossil bird footprint this big, and I go into the whole story and the significance of that giant flightless bird, Diatryma, and whether it was a predator or a fruit-eating bird. Well, I learned a lot writing this book, figuring out how to present it to the public, and some of the chapters really stand out for me. I think the most fun place was Ape Cave. How many people have been down there around St. Helens? Not very many. Okay, well that's vignette number 7, and you could be down there tomorrow morning. Get going right now. I'll pause long enough for you to leave. Oh, get a copy of the book first. Ape Cave is a lava tube. It is probably the single most heavily visited geologic site in the state. Thousands of visitors every year. So I tell the story of how lava tubes develop. They're like subway caves underground, inside the lava flow. And most people go into Ape Cave and they walk down the stairs the Forest Service built that go down into the entrance into this cave, and they walk down towards the end of the cave and back. It's about a mile round trip, completely underground, and then they go back up the ladder. But I also tell the story of the upper part, the wilder part of Ape Cave, which doesn't get nearly as many visitors. And has some really fascinating geologic features, including some which appear to be unique. Unique, perhaps, in the world. So this was a fun trip. I went with my friend John Skurlock, who's a pilot and photographer. Some of you may be familiar with John. And it was in November. There was about 6 inches of snow on the ground, and it was pouring down rain. Even though we were 30 feet underground, water was percolating through the fractured lava flow above us, and we did this cave trip with our umbrellas up. which really made it memorable. Then we had to hike back in the dark on the surface trail, and in the pouring rain and starting to sleet. So I'll never forget that one. But it was a lot of fun and required quite a bit of reading of the scientific literature for me and learning some new things in order to relay this story. Ape Cave's been told before in some geology guidebooks, but I don't think anywhere in the kind of detail that I go into in this chapter. There's an urban chapter, downtown Seattle, building stone tour. Fascinating rocks from all over the world. My friend David B. Williams from Seattle, who's a science writer, he does geology books. He just published a book called Too High, Too Steep about the removal of hills in downtown Seattle. It's a fabulous book. He was just at Village Books too. But he knew the locations of some of these really great building stones in Seattle, but he didn't really know the geologic story of them. So he invited me to go for a walk with him and include this chapter in my book in exchange for explaining to him what I thought these rocks might be. So that meant an awful lot of research on my own to try and understand what these rocks were, where did they come from. That was quite a bit of detective work. Like the Morton Gneiss there in Minnesota is probably the oldest building stone in the world, 3.5 billion years old. The pizza crust in the lobby of the Grand Hyatt Hotel. This is not the surface of the moon. This is not photographs. This is translucent rock. Rock slabs that are pretty big. There's my wife Kim for scale. That are 1/4 of an inch thick. And there are bright lights behind it, so the rock is translucent. For those of you who've ever studied geologic thin sections, looking at very thin, microscopically thin sections of rock through a microscope, doing rock studies, petrologic studies, this is kind of a gigantic version of that microscopic study. And David B. Williams and I spent a long time trying to figure out, is this really rock? Feels like plastic. And we finally managed to kind of just poke our heads around the corner through a gap about that big. You could see the backside of it, not polished, definitely rock, and the big bright lights. And then we could actually see the thickness of these slabs, about 1/4 of an inch. That was a hell of a story. So you can do this walking tour downtown Seattle. It's about a mile. Starting at Pioneer Square and ending up at the Grand Hyatt near Westlake Center, and see some really interesting geology, including learning a lot about urbanite, man-made stone, asphalt, concrete, cement. Some of the geology is very, very complex. Some of it is still not understood, or at least agreed really well by geologists. You can understand the rocks pretty well, but when you try to put the rocks together into the big picture of what happened here, what is the story that the rocks tell you about the history of the Earth, there's quite a bit of complexity and even controversy in some of these rocks. And one of these is the Skagit Gneiss up in the Skagit Gorge between New Halem and Diablo area. So this one was very difficult to explain, and I got serious case of frustration, and I just couldn't write. Total writer's block for almost 3 months. I just couldn't figure out how to explain this story without writing a technical paper. And geologist in Western's Geology Department, Ed Brown, agreed to review my story. He's done a lot of work in these rocks. And I finally cobbled together a draft that I wasn't very happy with, and I sent it to Ned, and he sent it back to me the next day, and he said, "Good start." That really sent me into a tailspin. But I think I eventually got it pretty well figured out. with reviews from plenty of help from people like Ned Brown and Liz Shermer up on campus to help me explain this. But it's very complicated, the Northern Cascades. Each of those, there's a map of a very crude, basic geologic map of the North Cascades. Here's the Skagit River, so concrete's right there, Mount Baker, and then the highway going over Highway 20. And so each of these colors represents a different type of rock. And these rocks are not necessarily related to each other. They're different ages. They look totally different from each other. It's a very complicated geologic history, and somehow I had to at least go through the basic explanation in that chapter. So I had to figure out how to do that out of that mess. Then I had to explain concepts like how do rocks get squished and crushed and deformed, how do minerals grow in different shapes from the way they originally were through directed pressure, compression inside the crust. The whole plate tectonic story is part of this. So it was a big complicated topic, and I really had a hard time with it, but I think it turned out okay. Ned signed my copy and said, pretty good. So, at least walking down at Willapa Bay, you get out of your car and you walk 100 yards out on the mudflat and you're done. Here you can see spruce stumps that are growing in the intertidal area. So at high tide, these stumps are underwater. And these trees have been dated to the winter between the 1699 and the 1700 growing season by counting tree rings. Some carbon dating has been done, some ring date, some dendrochronology or tree ring dating has been done. Some detective work has been done to try to figure out why did the land and when did the land get subsided below sea level. Combine that with historical records in Japan of tsunamis without an earthquake. And of course the Japanese were very good at keeping track of dates. So putting two and two together and coming up with something probably extremely close to 4, they come up with a magnitude 9 earthquake off our coast on the night of January 26, 1700. So everybody sound asleep? The ground shakes. The coastline subsides 5 to 10 feet. So places that are just barely above the waves are suddenly submerged below sea level. May have included some people's houses. 15 minutes later, the tsunamis start arriving. There are Native American stories of the thunderbird and the whale that are found from Northern California all the way up into Vancouver Island. And stories told of in my grandfather's grandfather's day, or my grandfather's mother's great-grandmother lost her life when suddenly the sea came into our village. So there's all these stories. And of course we can't date this event from the Native American stories. They didn't do time like we do. But just kind of putting 2 and 2 together once again and trying to make sense of the time period that was discussed in these stories. It made sense that we're talking about the same magnitude 9 earthquake here off our coast on January 26, 1700 that sent tsunamis to Japan and killed people. So here's a place where you can go see. You can touch these stumps, trees that and you're standing on land that subsided below sea level on that day, on that night. You can see forest soil underneath these tree stumps on the beach, which are, covered at high tide. But I think it's probably the best place to go actually see the remnants of the last really big magnitude 9 earthquake here. And I discuss what causes them and why we cannot say that we're overdue for the next one, unlike the New Yorker, those of you who read that article. The most walking is a 7.5-mile round trip on the north side of Mount St. Helens at the Johnston Ridge Visitor Center, and where I talk a little bit about the May 18th, 1980 eruption, but that story is told in many, many, many different places, so I talk specifically about the rocks and the deposits from that eruption that you're actually walking over as you walk along the trail. It's very, very scenic, very dramatic, and it's not a difficult trail despite the length. I highly recommend. Well, not now, it's snowing, I'm sure. This is a really frustrating chapter. Washaway Beach at the north end of Willapa Bay, Pacific County. Anybody know where this place is? There's a place where homes have been built right on bluffs, very low bluffs just above the beach. And the storm waves mostly are eroding these bluffs and the banks, and the houses are collapsing onto the beach. And you walk down the beach and you see sewer fittings sticking up out of the beach. And even offshore in the waves, you can see plumbing pipes sticking up. So there used to be people living there. Their homes were destroyed bit by bit as these bluffs recede. You know, nobody's been killed because of this, because they've seen it coming and they've had time to vacate their house as one corner starts to subside. It's been an ongoing process for a very long time, and it's a wonderful place to kind of go see the direct effects of geologic events on human beings, and sort of a lesson in folly. It's a great place to visit. You can see this house. It's being protected, surrounded by the beach almost. This is that house in 1990. And that's 400 yards. Here is the 2011 photograph. There's the house. So this is easily in a human lifetime, a small portion of a human lifetime. See the star marks the house. So I just thought this was a great place to include in the book. And I had my doubts about my directions out to a very specific place there on Washaway Beach. So I went back for a couple of more photographs to find this. Beach is closed. No public access. It was fully written except for a couple of photographs and a detail in the description of how to get to a particular location. No trespassing. So the entire chapter was deleted after completion. On the other hand, it helped cut down on my word total. So maybe it was a blessing in disguise. I have since heard that the signs are gone. So you can still go there, but you're not going to get directions out of my book. Sorry. So the book is chock full of diagrams that I made. I had to figure out how to explain geologic concepts to people who might not be familiar with them. So here's an example of how these of how these diagrams were made. I start with a pencil sketch, yes, paper, pencil, sitting at my desk, drinking a beer and eating chips and fending my cats off while I make these diagrams. And then I would scan the diagram, which is trying to convey a basic concept, in this case, how does magma rise up in the crust. And I would scan the diagram and trace it in Adobe Illustrator, a digital tracing. I just use my mouse to draw over the pencil lines, and then I can delete the pencil drawing. And then I can start playing around with it, changing shapes bit by bit. I can try colors. Trial and error, what looks good. Okay, not too bad. How about some labels? No, I like that color better. No, I like that color better. No, let's go to that one. So I can always change colors around in the program. And then I had to decide what am I going to label so that the diagrams are not too complicated, but that the things that are necessary to be explained are explained. So then I get the completed diagram and I send it off to my target audience reviewers, and I say, you get this? Just the diagram and the caption should be able to explain it. And they wrote back and said, no, I don't get it. What would you do? I don't know. Explain it to me better. Okay. Redraw it. And then, of course, it has to pass my peer reviewers. Be sure that these diagrams are within scientific believability. And then, of course, it has to fly past the publisher. Yeah, well, we're not going to reproduce that. The colors are really bad, or it's too big, or whatever. Send it back. Anyway, I made an awful lot of diagrams this way. The idea of trying to explain complicated processes, where a picture is worth 1,000 words, because I was over my word limit. After I got my copy of the book, by the way, the publisher sent the first box of books to Village Books, and I had to go down and buy a copy. But I get royalties from that. Probably didn't pay my gas up here. But I started looking the book over and I realized, my finger's in 8 photographs. My rock hammer is in only 1 photograph. How do you do a geology book and only have 1 photograph of a rock hammer? Don, how many photographs of your rock hammer do you have in your books?
10,000.
Yeah, 10,000, see? I mean, my pocket knife is in more than 8 photos. Here's a joke. How do you tell that you're looking at a collection of photographs taken by a geologist? It's more photographs of their hammer than of their spouse. Well, not in my book. Kim actually appears in 2 different photographs, and all my kids and grandkids are represented in the book. They're in different photographs. Although my stepdaughter wanted to be in a photograph where she couldn't be recognized. So all the kids are in the book, including the pug. See the pug in this photo? There's my stepdaughter, wanting to be sure that she was incognito, but still being scientifically helpful. You know where this is? You really got to go check out Rolling Boulder up at Whatcom Community College. Fantastic. I tell the story of that rock and of this rock, which needs a haircut. This is the glacial erratic down in Coopville. Kim providing scale. So I'll wrap up my little presentation with a word about the cover art. It's not a photograph. People have said, that's a great photograph of Mount St. Helens. Well, okay, so if that's Mount St. Helens, then what's this stuff over here? So it's, a geographic disconnect. If it's erupting volcano, it has to be Mount St. Helens. Well, only if it's a photograph. So Eric Knight in Los Angeles specializes in geologic art. So he painted this, and it was the publisher's decision what was going to be on the cover, not the author's. So he painted this view of a future eruption of Mount Rainier and what the effects of it could be. And so we see the west side of Mount Rainier and Lahars coming down and coming down through the Puyallup River drainage and through the location of the town of Ording, which is built on top of a 500-year-old volcanic mud flow. And then floods and large volumes of sediment going out into the Tacoma Tide Flats. It's a very detailed diagram. There's the Tacoma Dome. You can recognize individual buildings in this painting that Eric did. So we took the sketches of the painting and we sent it to quite a number of people at the Cascade Volcano Observatory and people like Kevin Scott, who have studied the eruptive history of Mount Rainier, say, is this realistic? Or is it believable? Yes, it's one possible scenario. And Eric and I liked the art so much. I'm glad he liked it. He did it. that we decided that he would make posters of these. So I have some of the posters, wall-size posters of this cover art, without my name on it and all that stuff. So just like this, only you don't even have the writing on it. They're in the back of the room there. I'll sell them to you for 15 bucks. So no book like this, like I said, can be written by yourself. A whole lot of people helped out, and I've done my best to give them credit. Like I said, every single chapter was peer-reviewed by a geologist who has done field work in the area and who is, in most cases, published on the topic in the scientific literature. So I now have a contract with Village Books to publish a road and trail guide to Mount Baker geology. That'll be out next summer. That's a step-by-step guide on Mount Baker roads and trails. After that, I'm writing a book on what it was like here during the Ice Age. Where did all the ice come from? How many times did ice come down out of the interior of Canada and cover the Salish Sea? We had about close to a mile of ice sitting here just a few thousand years ago. So that story, I'm working with a publisher on getting that started. And I'm looking to retire someday from my roof cleaning business and doing geology guiding as a retirement business, which would probably, keep me in beer and chips and gas for the van I'd have to rent, insurance. I don't know, it's not starting to sound so good now that I think about it. Anyway, so I thank you all for coming, and I'm happy to take any questions. Does anybody want to know anything else, or you just want to go straight to the cookies? Yes, Don.
I would argue with you about one point.
Please do, Don. You're good at that.
And that is that anyone with a master's degree from Western who can survive 10 years as a field assistant with West Hildreth is a professional geologist.
Let's say that I was paid in dinners at Milano and a beer or two every evening, and with a hard floor to sleep on in this one of the inns up in Glacier. Okay. Thank you, Don. I'll take that credit. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes. Ms. Librarian, what's your question?
Come on over here and say that again. So any chance your publisher will consider a volume 2?
Volume 2. No. We don't do volume 2, quote unquote. But I've got a lot of material, so I could conceivably publish my own book, find another publisher to do, the rejects from the first book. I shouldn't use that term, should I? I could call it Geology Underfoot Rejected. Yeah, so, I don't know, I guess it's possible, but not through this series. Yes.
Quick question. And the slide that you had of the taking temperature measurements.
In the fumaroles in Sherman Crater.
There's a bunch of yellowish looking stuff there. Is that sulfur, or was that sort of lichen or something like that?
There is no macroscopic life in Sherman Crater. It's 9,900 feet above sea level, 9,500 feet above sea level. All the yellow rock that you saw in the fumarole photo is sulfur-rich rocks, or sulfatarically altered rocks.
And
Yes?
I'm curious about the same photo. Do y'all use the same hole, or do you drill in?
We don't drill holes. We stick our collection tubes into the fumarole, into the steam vent, and collect gas straight out of the steam vent. So we don't do any drilling when we do that gas sampling in Sherman Crater.
It looked like that was a hole punched in.
I'm sorry?
It looked like that you had pushed in a pipe.
We put a pipe into the fumarole vent to channel the
I got you.
channel the gas out of the fumarole vent and into a
So you could
vacuum
use-
flask.
You could use a different
Yeah, we find a fumarole that gives us good volume, good flow. Yes. Yes.
What do you plan to do with the chapters that didn't make it into the book?
What am I going to do? I think some of those chapters I'll end up writing up in a briefer form and putting them on the blog.
I'm interested in the
Yeah. I'm not quite sure which ones I'm going to write and whether I would include those in there or not. And I'm going to have to do some thinking about what I want to do with those unwritten. Mostly, well, partially unwritten. De-written? Uncompleted chapters. Stay tuned. Any more questions? Okay. Yeah.
Yeah,
Rob.
going back to the Seattle rocks, city rocks, was fascinating me. Did you figure out what kind of rock the pizza crusts were?
Oh yes, the pizza crust rock is a rock called travertine, which is a hot spring deposit, and it probably comes from Mexico, although it possibly comes from Turkey. Probably from Turkey. It's a hot spring deposit rock, which is cut into very thin slabs.
Where was this? Where was that?
That's the translucent pizza crust rock in the Grand Hyatt Hotel.
Oh, okay.
Any more questions? Yes?
I was just curious if, with your work and study, did you go to visit the North Site area?
At Oso?
Yeah. Or is that?
The Oso landslide occurred when the book was mostly written. And I had a chance to, I could have included it at the very end of the writing process, but they were still doing rescue and it wasn't open to the public. And I didn't want to be giving people directions to go into there. We didn't know if it was ever going to be opened up to the public. It might be preserved as a memorial. So I did not include Oso in the book.
Yeah, I actually was more curious if you personally went, have gone just
Oh,
as.
oh, yes, yes, I have been there. I have been there with geologists, landslide geologists, and have trumped through the mud and seen the very, very tragic wreckage. I have been there. Any other questions? Okay, well, if you're interested in a copy of the book, they're for sale on the back table. And there's also the posters, which my two lovely assistants will be happy to sell to you. And otherwise, there's juice and cookies, and the evening is drawing nigh.
And
Thank you so much.
Consider signing up to hear about future events here.
Future, oh yeah, there's a sign-up sheet to know about more events coming up. Thank you.